Thank you. I think we may start.
I think we might. Yes, yes. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the day 2 of Colloquia Ceranea, and we have a panel I was particularly looking forward to, so I was delighted to be asked to chair it, which is Infidels, Heresies, and Heresiology in the Byzantine World. That what I'll do, how we'll run this is that everybody has 20 minutes. I'll signal to people when they've got 5 minutes left, and that we will have questions on all the papers at the end. Okay, well, I think that without further ado, we might as well start. So the first speaker is Petra Melichar from the Czech Academy of Sciences, and her topic is Maria, the nun Makaria, and the last entry of the Synodikon of Orthodoxy. Okay, thank you very much, Petra.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to greet you from afar and thank the organizers for their invitation and for making this exciting conference possible. So in today's paper, I would like to focus on the last entry in the list of empresses of the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which reads, Maria, Our Lady, who assuming the divine and angelic dress, became the nun Makaria, eternal be her memory. This simple line closes the ranks of pious empresses of the Byzantine Empire in the Synodicon of Orthodoxy, for their only Synodicon, that pledges eternal glory to those who died in peace with their church. Jean Gouillard, the editor of the Synodicon, published in 1967 in Travaux et Mémoires, and Prosopographisches Lexikon der Palalogenzeit claim that this line refers to Maria of Trebizond, the third wife of John VIII, Palaiologos, and the last crowned empress of the Byzantine Empire. The present paper seeks to counter this claim, proposes a new owner of the above identity, and questions the assumed dating of the Gouillard Synodicon. Before focusing on these aims, let us briefly introduce the source. The origins of the Synodicon go back to the iconoclast controversy of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. This dramatic struggle over the character of private prayer led to the death, mutilation, and exile of many supporters of icon worship, while many works of religious art were lost or destroyed by the iconoclasts. After the death of Theophilos II, the last iconoclast emperor, his wife, Empress Theodora, decided to re-establish the worship of icons. On March 11, 843, she and her young son, Michael III, participated in a symbolic procession from the iconophile Theotokos Church in Blastares to Hagia Sophia, a former place of worship of the iconoclasts. There, Patriarch Methodius celebrated a festive liturgy and proclaimed icon worship a doctrine of the Orthodox Church. Soon after this event, the first Synodica were written to protect the true teaching from heresy. The Synodicon of Orthodoxy, which emerged between 843 and 920, is divided into 3 parts. The first of these gives thanks to God. The second acclaims and commemorates the emperors, empresses, patriarchs, martyrs, and confessors who remained faithful to Orthodox teaching. And the third proclaims anathema over various heresies and those who promoted them. The second and third sections of the document continued to grow throughout the centuries. The Synodicon, published by Jean Gouillard, was concluded shortly before the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. I'm sorry, I forgot to give you all the data. So coming back to the list of pious empresses, the final line commemorates Empress Maria, who became the nun Makaria. Among the late Byzantine imperial consorts, there were three who bore the name Maria. Maria of Armenia, wife of Michael IX, Maria of Bulgaria, wife of Andronicus IV, and the already mentioned Maria of Trebizond.
Sorry, we still see the first slide.
Oh
Yes,
no.
I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
If you switch to slideshow, might be the.
Yes, that's so strange. You still see the first slide, so you haven't.
Now we don't see anything.
This was the introduction, and this was. I will just do this. Can you see it now?
No, you have to start once more screen sharing. This button, red button on the.
Yeah. Oh no. Because it doesn't do it. Like I cannot really see it now. It only offers me the screen that I have. I do not know how to bring it in.
Actually allow ClickMeeting.com to see your screen when you hit that red button at the bottom.
Yeah, I just it doesn't allow me to do it for some reason.
You have to choose in this pop-up window which window. Click which window. Point with your mouse and click which window you want to share. I think it's
but it only offers me the like the screen I see, like with all your pictures.
You may choose it and switch on your laptop to your and then run your PowerPoint presentation. Just we will see for a while us repeat it. Choose it and just start your presentation on your laptop, and we'll see it.
I'm so sorry, it's not doing it. Jan, do you please have by any chance my presentation which I sent to you?
Yeah, I can. Your previous version. Yeah, which you have.
Just take that one because I don't know how to do it. It's just not doing it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I will give you. I will make you present, and you can change slides on your own. So you can just use arrows on your keyboard to change slide. Okay. Left, right.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So I will just show you at least. Thank you so much, Jan. So I will at least show you the introduction one. I'm sorry. It was just it's nothing new really. It's just so that if something I didn't pronounce correctly, that you still have a chance to read it up. So I got to this window, and these are the three empresses who actually were called Maria. But I will then continue. Like the Maria of Armenia, the first one, could not be our Maria because she is mentioned earlier in the list as, I quote, Maria who acquired the monastic name Xeni. So it was not the first Maria, the wife of Michael IX. As I have already mentioned, two important scholars assumed that the empress closing the list of the Synodicon empresses was the beautiful Maria of Trebizond. Jean Guyard made this assumption in the footnotes to his edition of the Synodicon, while Alexander Kashdan in the ODB dated the last known recension of the Synodicon to 1439, the year of Maria's death. The scholars who produced Prokopios' lexicon, their Palalogon site, likewise noted that Maria went by the monastic name Makaria. Let us therefore consider this possibility. As for Maria of Trebizond's biography, the sources render the following essential information. As a young girl, she witnessed the sad death of her mother and her brother's usurpation of the throne of Trebizond. In 1426-1427, she arrived in Constantinople, as bride of John VIII after his previous wife, Sophia of Montferrat, left him and entered an Italian nunnery. The marriage of John and Maria, which took place in September 1427, seems to have been a happy one, even though it remained childless. Maria died of an illness on December 17, 1439, while her husband participated on the Council of Ferrara, Florence, which resulted in the union of the Catholic and Orthodox Church known as the Union of Florence. While Maria of Trebizond was the last crowned empress of Byzantium, it is nevertheless improbable that she would have been the Maria mentioned in the last line of the empress's list. In the first place, no primary source testifies that Maria of Trebizond would have accepted the veil. John Evgenikos, who wrote a monody on the empress, which he presented at her funeral shortly after her death, titled his speech, I quote, "Monody on the Eternal and Holy Our Lady and Empress Maria," end quote. In the monody itself, he refers to Maria as an empress, Despina and Augusta, but nowhere mentions that she would have taken the monastic vows. Also, Silvestros Siropoulos, a contemporary of the empress, writing in his memoirs about her death, speaks at length about the bright shining comet, which allegedly announced Maria's death, but does not mention what would have been a much more significant information, that is, that the empress proved her piety by becoming a nun before her death. His text describes her strictly and repeatedly as empress, Despina. From among other sources, let us mention yet a third author, a well-known courtier, George Francis, who likewise described the death of the empress, once again giving her the title Despina. This, of course, is most suspect. Had Maria taken the veil, considering her popularity among her subjects and the high honor of the monastic estate in the Byzantine society, it is unlikely that contemporary historians and sources would have failed to celebrate her pious action. The Synodicon itself also mentions Maria of Trebizond, but, in my opinion, not in the list of pious empresses, but only in a joint acclamation along with her husband. I quote, "To John, the most pious emperor and autocrator of the Romans, Palaiologos, and Maria, the most pious empress, many years," end quote. As the final words indicate, this is not a prayer for the dead, but an acclamation read apparently as a prayer for the ruling imperial couple in course of their lives. It is safe to conclude that the evidence of the primary sources unanimously speaks against Maria of Trebizond becoming a nun. The argument for this empress thus hinges on an error of the editor, who apparently presumed that as Maria was the last empress of Byzantium, she must also conclude the Synodicon list. As far as his footnotes to the list of empresses are concerned, it was not his only error. The reason why Guyard's conclusion must be rejected and why Maria does not receive the yearly prayers of the Orthodox believers today seems to have been connected with the union with the Catholic Church signed by her husband, John VIII, in Florence in 1439. For it is not only Maria of Trebizond who was not numbered among the pious empresses. In fact, all three empresses who died after the conclusion of the Union of Florence, that is, Maria of Trebizond, Arinda Lucio, and wife of Manuel II, Maria Helene of Serbia, were excluded from the Synodicon. Likewise, the name of their predecessor, Anna of Hungary, wife of Andronicus II, who died under the Union of Lyon, concluded by Michael VIII in 1274, was not entered in the empresses list. As Maria of Trebizond cannot have been the Maria of the Synodicon, we must now turn our attention to the only remaining person who can claim this identity, which is Maria of Bulgaria. This princess came to Byzantium as a young child in 1356 and became the wife of Andronicus IV, the eldest son of John V and his wife Helene Cantacuzeni. Andronicus repeatedly rebelled against his father, and Maria participated on his dangerous ventures and followed him repeatedly to prison and exile. The couple had one child, a son by the name of John, who later became known as John VII. In 1376, Andronicus managed, with Turkish help, to seize Constantinople and take over its government. He and his wife were crowned emperors. Due to these struggles, John V decided to pass his crown onto his second son, Manuel, thus bypassing the direct dynastic line. After Andronicus IV died in 1385, Maria became a nun. Instead of taking residence in one of the Byzantine convents, as would have been expected, she gave her support to her son, who continued to feud against his grandfather John V and his uncle Manuel II. She followed John not only to exile, but also on his diplomatic missions to Italy. When he and Manuel made peace, the senior emperor went to the west in order to acquire military aid. John VII took over the rule in Constantinople, moving to the capital with his mother and his young wife. At the end of her life, Maria thus came to rule once more the court of Constantinople. She became known for her charitable actions before she suddenly disappeared from the sources around the year 1400. Unlike Maria of Trebizond, Maria of Bulgaria certainly did take the veil, as the following inscription preserved in a gospel book proves. So this inscription says, "The most holy and sacred gospel book was given to me, Brother Peter of the Order of the Least Brothers, called by the Italians the Minorites, by the grace of God, the Archbishop of Milan in Liguria, while I was still the Bishop of Novara. I received it from the exalted and illustrious lady of the Romei, Empress Maria, who took the name in religion Makaria, after she came with her son, the most exalted and illustrious emperor of the Romei, Lord John Palaiologos Ticino in Liguria, at the time when the most illustrious Duke of Milan, Lord Gian Galeazzo, the Count of Pavia, was the ruler of the Ligurians in the year of our Lord 1392. In course of her voyage to Italy, Maria of Bulgaria met Peter Philarchos, Bishop of Novara, later Pope Alexander V, and presented him with the above book. His inscription testifies to us the important truth that Maria assumed the name Makaria as her monastic name. Prosopographisches Lexikon der Palaiologen site mentions that she became a nun with the name Makaria, though with a question mark, in the year 1392. The precise year in which Maria decided to take this step is not known. According to the prevalent custom among the late Byzantine empresses, she may have done so soon after the death of her husband, which occurred in June 1385. As no other late Byzantine empress by the name Maria chose the monastic name Makaria, it is clear that the line closing the list of Byzantine empresses could only refer to one person, Maria of Bulgaria. Having thus settled the identity of Maria Makaria, we may inquire into the impact of this conclusion on the dating of the Synodicon. In the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium, Alexander Kashdan dated the document to the year of the last name that was added to the document. According to Guyard, this was the name of Maria of Trebizond, and Kashdan accordingly dated the Synodicon to 1439, the year of her death. If the dating of the Synodicon depended on the last empress included in it, it would now have to be redated to 1400, which is the probable year of death of Maria of Bulgaria. But this is not the case. After Maria of Bulgaria, another imperial name was added to the Synodicon. It was the name of her brother-in-law, Manuel II, who died on July 21st, 1425. His name is the last addition to the document edited by Jean Guyard, which means that the Synodicon was concluded and therefore should be dated to the year of death of Manuel, 1425, and not 14 years later, as claimed by Kashdan in the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the conclusion caught me by surprise there. After that, our next speaker is Paolo Angelini. I have huge respect for independent scholars who have other skills. Paolo is a qualified lawyer. He's also a former lecturer at the University of Chile and a former fellow at Dumbarton Oaks. And he is speaking to us today.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
We can see the screen.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
So I start. Thank you for your generous presentation, Andrew.
Okay.
Thank you for having accepted my paper. So we will spend the next minutes on the Syntagma of Blastares. I hope you will survive. Normally I deal with bankruptcy and labor law, so it's better to deal with Byzantine law and physical mutilation and corporal punishment and death penalty. That's better. So let's start. The Syntagma was redacted between 1334 and 1335. It's a nomocanon, and it's composed of both canon law and secular laws, nomo in politikoi. It is also a legal encyclopedia. It's very easy to read and to consult because there is an index at the beginning, so it's very useful for the reader. He can find immediately the matter of the law. It is composed of 303 chapters, which are arranged in alphabetical order. So the name Syntagma Katastokein derives from the alphabetical order. So the texts are composed of canons and secular laws. I mean, you find first the texts of canon law, and then you have secular law regulating the same legal matter. You can find one or more secular law, and the text should be extracted from the Prokiron, the Basilica, and the Isagoge. It's better than the previous nomocanons because it contains the full excerpts of secular laws, whereas the other nomocanons just have only references like book first, title first, law one of the code. So you have not in the other nomocanon the full text, and that you have in the Syntagma. So I will focus on a few passages that could be interesting for the conference. So the definition of orthodoxy, apostasies, heresies in canon law, heresies in secular law, and then I will focus on Bogomils, Catholics, Jews, and also I added a little appendix on the tripartite codification of Stefan Dushan, which was the whole topic of my doctoral dissertation. So let's start from the Prologos. In the Prologos, you have the definition of Orthodox faith. So it's taken from the first book of the code, which was included in the first book of the Basilics. And you find also that references in the so-called nomocanon of Photios. So here you see in red the definition of Christian and the definition of heretic. I mean, I use the edition of the Patrologia Greca because I have the Latin translation. So for me, it's more or less to read in Italian. So I use that one. Now you see the secular laws on apostasy on chapter A1 after the Prologos, and here you see the legal consequences of apostasies. In this case, we find two cases: the ones who go back to paganism and they suffered the death penalty, and the ones who become heretics. So they suffer legal limitation, both in the active legal capacity, so doing last wills, donation, but also in the passive legal capacity. They could not be appointed as heirs, and they could not do succession ab intestato. They could not inherit without a testament. So there was a strong limitation in the field of secular law. In the second chapters, we find it's a very long rubric. It says like on and how the ones who convert from heresies must be received. Here, it's really the heart of the heresy legislation. You have all the heresies listed like that. Here you have the Eunomianis, the Montanists, the Pepuzenis. You have also Montanists, and so on. So there is a Donatists. You have a chapter about Novato. So you have all the ancient heresies who had been disciplined in Justinian's legal compilation, the Corpus Iuris Civilis. This legislation was included in the basilics, and then from the basilics, the legislation was included in the Syntagma of Blastares. So, among the heresies, we find Bogomils. Here you have the text. You have the etymology of the name. Then you have, sorry, I switch on my laptop, otherwise it becomes too chaotic. You have the etymology of the name, the dualistic conception, the rejection of the Old Testament, the rejection of Trinity, which was part of their faith. At the end, you do not have the consequences in a secular law. So there were no secular law included specific about Bogomils in the Syntagma of Blastares. At the end of the chapter 8.2, you find the leges civiles, the nomoi politikoi, where the legal consequences in the field of civil law, of secular law. I'm sorry, I sometimes use the word civil law, but it's both civil and penal law. So you have the secular laws. You see here the limitations in legal capacity, no possibilities of appointing heirs, no public dignities for heretics, no testimony against Orthodox. You find the legal limitation in green. I will try to. Okay. And we can say which the most popular ones were the Manichaeans, and normally the cutting of the head was imposed over Manichaeans, so their position was very bad, and also Montanists, they were in a bad position. So these are the consequences in a secular law, but it's penal law, and you have also consequences in secular law, but in civil law. It's the affection of the legal capacity. Also, heretics were excluded from privileges. For instance, in case of debts, also the wife of a heretic was not. Her dowry had no privileges against creditors, so which was provided for Orthodox. That privilege was granted to Orthodox people. So these are, in a few words, the legal limitation. Then we move to another chapter, L5, which is the chapter on Latins. So you see that there are only references and not direct tests. So when we deal with Latins, we must go back or to other letters. So there were no legal contents in the chapter on Latins. And we have to go back to move to other chapters. And so we see that in chapter on Jews and on Azims, you see the rubric. When then you go down and you see that there is a passages, the Azimis contra Latinos, so on Azims and against Latins, in which you have like a sort of equiparation between the way of celebrating Eucharisty by Jews and Latin. Everything in that passage is focused on Azim. And so it's called like celebrating more Judaico, thus according to the Jewish custom, and it was forbidden and heavily criticized in these passages. Here there is another problem that also in these chapters you have no legal consequences for Catholics, for Latins, because it derives from the old Justinian legislation, and also there were no consequences for Catholics. So at the end of the chapters, you have the secular laws, and you see that there is like a sort of tolerance for Jews, but there is not tolerance at all for proselytism. And the death penalty was imposed for proselytism, but at least, for instance, it was granted to Jews to have the mancipium. Here you have the term andrapodon, which is the Roman mancipium, which is the possibility of have Christian slaves. So you see that in canon law you have a lot of passages, whereas in civil law the syntagma is not so strong. But the main problem is that the Byzantine legislation extracted from the secular law compilation, there were no laws for these topics. So the question is how to use the syntagma. Bogomils and Catholic were current issues, but the legislation was based on Justinianic legislation, so there were no specific penal sanction for Catholics and Bogomils, and no specific limitation in civil law. So how to use it? The holy idea that I had, it's like to use the analogia legis. Here you find the definition. So in the practice, you take a law and use this law for a similar case. I mean, as a modern jurist, we think that each field of the law can be covered by the law, but there are always cases which are not directly disciplined, so we have to use this analogia legis. So we use another law, and we take another law and we use for the legal issues. For instance, for Manichaeans and for Bogomils, I would use the legislation about Manichaeans and Paulician. I would use the concept of duality and the rejection of the Trinity, maybe, and I will use that kind of legislation. Now let's see. Let's move in the Serbian Greek Empire of Dusan, where they translated the Syntagma of Blastares, which became part of the tripartite codification. So the Syntagma was translated into Slav language. You see here, for instance, chapter A2. And you have Zakoni Grazzi, which is the rubric for secular laws, and you have all the legislation about heretics, the legal limitation which we saw before. And now we can suppose how they used the Syntagma of Blastares in Serbia, because we have direct references in the Code of Dusan. In the first part, ecclesiastical law is regulated, so we have chapters about the Latin heresy and the references to the laws of the Holy Fathers. The laws of the Holy Fathers are generally considered Byzantine laws, which were utilized also in the Greek Serbian Empire. We have the definition again of Latin heresy and Latin faith, and I mean this is an English translation of Malcolm Burr. Here again you have Latin faith and a reference to the laws of the Holy Fathers. And then in chapter 9 you have the definition of half believers, which is supposed to be also Catholics, because there were Serbian Catholic communities in Serbia, so they tried to regulate their presence and to stop proselytism among Orthodox people. Then we move to other chapters, and then you have the word heretics. So chapter 10, which includes very harsh punishments, was probably used for other heretics and not for Catholics, because here you have, for instance, Latin heresy, Latin faith. So probably when in chapter 10 you find heretics, maybe the chapter is for other kind of heretics, as for instance, maybe Bogomils. And here you have also, for instance, chapter 85 on heretical words. The term used in the Code of Dusan is babuška riječ, which means Bogomil speech, Bogomil words. So that was the punishment for the people who pronounced a Bogomil speech. And you see the difference between noblemen and commoners. In case a sanction of 100 peppers, which is a big sanction. In the other case, you see a lower pecuniary sanction, but you find that they use the corporal punishment for people who were commoners. So that was the point. I conclude my paper. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm open to all questions and suggestions, because I do understand that there are a lot of questions and not answers, not too many answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I was reaching for my own copy of Stefan Dusan. That if we have sort of questions at the end, and for the present, crack on with the Pavla Gkantzios Drápelová, graduate Charles University and the National and Kapodistrian Universities of Athens, and now at the Czech Academy of Science, and speaking on Prokopios, a new topic, Prokopios on the religion of the Slavs, a statistical approach.
Sorry to interrupt. Paolo, please stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
No, Paolo, please stop sharing your screen. Paolo Angelini.
I don't share my screen.
I'm addressing Paolo Angelini. Sorry for being not clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Paolo's.
Okay. So can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
You want to
good.
put it on slideshow?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of Colloquia, because I think it's great that people can meet, at least online, in these difficult and strange times, and to get feedback for their work. And now let's go to the presentation. In my today's presentation, I will focus on the very famous Prokopios text on the Slavic religion that was included in his text on the wars. In his excursus on the Slavs, Prokopios mentioned very briefly also religious beliefs of Slavs, or Sklavenoi, as he calls Slavs in his texts. And despite its relative shortness, the testimony belongs to the most quoted ones, and also to the most discussed ones concerning the pre-Christian Slavic religion. It has provoked many debates concerning various interpretations and also concerning its reliability. But today, in my paper, I would like to present a slightly different approach to this text. And in my research, I focused on vocabulary used by Prokopios to describe the religion of Sklavenoi, and I've compared it with the vocabulary used in other passages describing religion or religious practices of other ethnicities mentioned in his text. I compared frequencies of various terms that Prokopios used, and I also compared to what extent are similar the contents. So the present paper should be understood as a kind of a case study whose goal is to answer how unique the passage on Slavic religion in Prokopios' work actually is, and to what extent it can be compared with information about other barbarians that were mentioned in Prokopios' text. First of all, let's look closely on the first sentence that mentions the creator of lightning. We can see here the English translation. They believe that one God, the maker of lightning, is alone Lord of all things. This sentence has actually provoked many debates among scholars, and it belongs to really one of the most frequently quoted passages from Prokopios' work concerning the Slavs. Traditionally, the passage is considered to be the oldest written testimony on the god Perun or Svarog. It is interesting to note that in case of other barbarians, the cult of any god of thunder or lightning is not mentioned at all by Prokopios. And concerning other ethnic groups in the Prokopios works, in most cases there are no indications of functions of particular deities, and no mention exists suggesting that the position of one of the gods would be more significant than the position of others. Or there are, like, let's say, no situations or no other passages that would indicate that in case of some other barbarians there is just one sole god. The only exceptions exist in the cases of the inhabitants on the island of Thule and Persians. In the case of the inhabitants of Thule, Prokopios noted that they sacrifice a captive to Ares, whom they regard as the greatest god. So we can see a kind of similarity. In both cases, the Slavs and the inhabitants of Thule, the so-called Skridhifini, the main god is mentioned. In addition, in both cases, a kind of parallelism to ancient religion can be seen. In case of Thule, we can see the god who Prokopios calls Ares. In the case of Slavs, there is the god who creates Astrape, that demonstrates the endeavor to compare the god with the ancient Zeus, who was sometimes called Astropaios. Such an interpretatio Greca and various borrowings from the classical text are quite common practice in the Prokopios in general, both in connection with the Slavs and other ethnic groups. In addition, several scholars noted the possibility of a different reading and interpretation of the passage about the main god of the Slavs, using a different manuscript edition of Prokopius' text from the turn of the 13th and 14th centuries. In this version exists the plural form of the word theos, and this version of text enables to translate the passage as they believe that one of the gods, the god of lightning, is the chief ruler of everything. If this variant reading is accepted, we can see that there is even one more similarity with the description of the inhabitants of Thule. In both cases, Prokopios speaks about a kind of henotheism, thus means worship of one overarching god beside which exist various other deities. And such an interpretation makes actually the reports on the Slavic religion and on the religion of Thule's inhabitants even closer in Prokopius' text. Moreover, in the case of the Persians, Prokopius stated that they honor a fire above all gods, and moreover, there exists in this passage a connection to ancient Roman cult. In addition, even the word demiurgos that was used in the case of Sklavenoi is not a common expression in Prokopius' works, and apart from the Slavs, the term was used exclusively in the Christian context in the sense of the Christian God, the Creator. Prokopius' text also informs that except of the Creator of the lightning, Sklavenoi also revere rivers and nymphs and other spirits. This passage begins with the verb to worship, sevo. So, this verb was used actually many times in Prokopius' text, but its use with the paganistic cults was rather limited, and we can see that only in case of Persians, the Blemias and Nobatai, Himiarites, Thule, Sklavenoi, and in the buildings in the context with Tsanoi and Samaritans was used. And in all the other cases, it was used either with Christians or in a figurative sense. In addition, the text indicates the author endeavor to emphasize the Slavs' relationship to the water deities. Prokopius literally states that the Slavs worshipped rivers. The term potamos in connection with religion appeared only twice in Prokopius' text. In the case of the Slavs, and again in the context with the inhabitants of the island of Thule. In the case of the inhabitants of Thule, Prokopius mentioned that they worship demons living in water springs. A similar practice is not mentioned for any other nation. Actually, the only case where I found, let's say, a situation when a river was related to some kind of sacrifices was in the case of Franks, when Prokopius notes that sacrificed women and children were thrown to a river by the Franks, but there is not a direct indication that the river would be worshipped. And furthermore, the word nymph that was used in the context with the Slavs is also relatively rare in the Prokopius text. This noun did not necessarily expressed in his text a water deity, but was very often used to refer to a young woman or a bride. Prokopius used the term nymph in the sense of a water deity only twice in his text, in the context of the Slavs and in the context of the Persians. In the case of the Slavs, various researchers have interpreted this testimony about the nymphs as evidence of faith in Rusalki. In the case of the Persians, however, it was just a mere mention that does not allow to formulate any hypothesis about the Persians' belief in water deities, as Prokopios reports that during his military expedition to Byzantine Syria, Persian King Khosroe sacrificed to the nymphs of Daphne. That was a very important cult site near Antioch. So it actually means that the Persian king visited and made sacrifices at a place related to a Hellenic cult. Prokopios also stated that the Slavs worshipped various demons. The term daimonion, which Prokopios used in the case of the Slavs, appeared in his works more than 20 times. But again, only in 2 cases was the word used in the same sense as in the case of the Slavs, that someone worships some supernatural powers. And again, these cases were Persians and the inhabitants of the island of Thule. In addition, Prokopios mentioned that prophecies were performed in connection with the worship of these various deities. Words expressing divination or a prophecy with the same word-forming root, manteia, manteos, or manteon, appeared in the context of different nations, including the Byzantines themselves and the ancient Greeks. In addition to these terms, Prokopios used also the noun loion several times, but not in the context with the Slavs. But concerning all the examples that I found in Prokopios' text, the closest expression was included in the context with the Franks, in whose case Prokopios mentioned that they sacrificed to obtain oracles. Another rather discussed topic in Prokopios' statement is that the Slavs did not believe in fate. Actually, this statement is rather interesting from the aspect that in no one other case of any other barbarians, Prokopios made a similar expression, and he actually didn't deal with the belief in fate in cases of other ethnicities. So there are actually no parallels to this statement, and moreover, Prokopios also used the verb meiromai just once in his work. A rather interesting topic are the sacrifices in Prokopios' text. The short passage on the Slavs and their religion mentions actually several times that the Slavs sacrificed to their deities. In the case of the main god, Prokopios states that cattle and other sacrifices were sacrificed to him. This is rather interesting because actually, just in this case, Prokopios mentioned directly a sacrificial animal. There are no parallels, again, to this statement in his work. Actually, in the short passage on the Slavic religious beliefs, Prokopios noted sacrifices several times. Words related to sacrifices have actually the highest frequency in comparison with other barbaric nations. And I think this is really interesting because, for example, there are definitely very, very few, let's say, direct mentions related to the Slavs in comparison, for example, with the Persians or with the Franks or Heruls. These nations were definitely many more times mentioned by Prokopios than the Slavs or the Thule. But we can see that in the case of the Slavs and Thule, the frequencies of the use of the words related to sacrifices are really very high. If we look at the statistics, we can see that all the terms used by Prokopios to denote sacrifices in case of the Slavs, the verb theo, thisia, and hieria, appeared also in connection with other barbarians, and always exclusively in the context of pagan religion. Of a special interest is the reality that all 3 terms were also used to describe human sacrifices in the case of some other barbarians. The only 2 nations in whose context the terms were never used explicitly in the sense of human sacrifice are the Persians and the Slavs. In the context of Slavs, Prokopios did not mention human sacrifices at any point, although a hypothesis was formulated in the past that a certain passage in his work can be interpreted as evidence on the practice of sacrificing prisoners. In his study, Eugenio Lujan expressed the view that Prokopius' description of the events that followed the conquest of the Byzantine city of Toperos in 549-550 could be interpreted as a ritual sacrifice of prisoners by the Slavs. The scholar drew his attention to the reality that the passage mentioned several ways in which the prisoners were killed after the conquest of the city. He mentioned the impalement, beating to death, and burning the prisoners alive together with cattle. And Eugenio Lujan attempted to interpret those as ritual practices, comparing them with information on Slavic human sacrifices from other sources. During my research, I analyzed the passage and came to the conclusion that the impalement is one of the usual forms of punishment or an act of revenge in the Prokopius works, and is mentioned in connection with various nations, including the Byzantines themselves. The only thing that makes the description of the impalement specific in the case of Slavs is actually the use of different vocabulary. The terms that were used in the case of Slavs are completely different to all the other cases of the impalement that is usually mentioned by Prokopius with the use of the one specific verb. From the aspect of the described brutality, the two sentences that followed and that concern the beating to death and burning alive are really exceptional in Prokopius' work. Prokopius did not mention the beating or burning of prisoners anywhere else in his work. The acts of beatings or burning were usually associated with battles as a part of the war turmoil. In no other case it is possible to find in the Prokopius works a similar testimony. Nevertheless, the question remains whether the text in question can be interpreted as Lujan did. It means as an indirect evidence of prisoners' sacrifice. Definitely, the passage about the fate of the prisoners in 549 is very interesting, and it's not possible to find parallels to this story in Prokopius' work. But I'm not sure whether it's possible to interpret it as an evidence, as an indirect evidence on prisoners' sacrifices. So, definitely worth mentioning is the reality that most information on pagan religion in case of various barbarians mentioned by Prokopius were just random mentions that only completed the picture of a certain situation. In the case of some barbarian ethnicities, the topic of religion was not addressed at all by Prokopius. Only in the cases of the Slavs, Abaskoi and Skrithifini from Thule, the descriptions of religion are parts of a broader excursus into the culture of these nations, and therefore the information about the pagan faith of these three groups at Prokopius is the most detailed. These three descriptions also bear several similar features, although it can be said that the descriptions of the Slavic religion and the religion of the inhabitants of the island of Thule are closest ones, and on the contrary, there is almost no match and no parallels between the vocabulary and information provided by Prokopius in cases of the Slavs and Abaskoi. Nevertheless, we could see that some of the topics mentioned by Prokopius in a connection with the Slavs were not mentioned in context with other barbarians, for example, fate. Some other motifs were widespread and found in description of other barbarians too, for example, the topic of prophecy. And various times, we could see that the vocabulary used by Prokopius in the context with the Slavic religion was rather similar to the vocabulary used in the context with the inhabitants of Thule and Persians. It was, for example, in the case of sacrifices, in the case of the worship of demons and water deities, and several others. If we look on the list of terms employed by Prokopios in the sentences on the religion of the Slavs, it is obvious that most matches exist in cases of Thule and Persians and Slavs that we can see here. Actually, many matches exist also in the case of Christians that we can see here. But of course, here the vocabulary was used in a completely different context and sense than in the case of the barbarians. Worth mentioning is also the reality that in the case of Persians, we speak about terms that were incorporated in narrations about Persians in various chapters of Prokopius' work, and they do not present a consistent testimony about their religion, but just random information in the context of other events, and sometimes were even related just to a particular person, for example, the king Chosroes, and didn't represent the beliefs of a group or of the whole nation. In the case of the inhabitants from Thule, the situation is the same like the one of Sklavenoi. It is a part of a broader excursus that should introduce to readers some information about the particular ethnicity. Definitely, it's interesting that the description of the religion of the Slavs has most in common with the description of the religion of the slightly mysterious ethnicity Scritifini, which is mentioned only in one chapter of Prokopius' work. Today, the prevailing view is that the island of Thule, inhabited by these Scritifini, was a designation for Scandinavia. The parallels in the description of the religions of the Slavs and Scritifini from Thule indicate that Prokopius and his contemporaries probably did not have much experience with either nation, and it was desirable to introduce them. Various modern scholars have expressed the opinion that Prokopius evidently perceived the Slavs as newcomers. Thus, it seems that it was necessary to introduce comprehensively the new entity. And in case of the inhabitants of Thule, of course, there definitely existed a huge distance. In describing the regions of both, Prokopius used a vocabulary and context he knew from classical texts to find parallels to the type of paganism most familiar to him. In the case of the Slavs, the main god is the ruler of lightning. In the case of Scritifini, it is Ares. Both nations worship waters and various demons or spirits, and in case of the Slavs, Prokopius even used the term nymph, that he used exclusively in the same sense in the case of Persians visiting the ancient cult site in Daphne. Some authors discussed the methodological dilemma to what extent Prokopius' testimony on Sklavenoi can represent an ethnographic stereotype impacted by classical tradition. However, this does not mean that the information has to be definitely false. But since Prokopius himself was most likely not an eyewitness, and the information was probably passed on to him, he tended to link his new knowledge to the paganism he was aware of, that is, to the ancient religion he knew from classical texts. Such an interpretatio Graeca and search for parallels with Greek realities can be found also in other passages concerning not only the Slavs, but also other barbarians. It is also important to mention that in other aspects, the descriptions of the Slavs and the Scriptini from Thule are not similar. There are no matches concerning other topics different to religion. But in case of the religion, it is obvious that Prokopius, in the context of the Slavs and Scriptini, definitely followed very similar patterns. Thank you for your attention. This is the end of the presentation.
Thank you immensely. It was great stuff. So our last speaker is Johann Anton Zieme, and from the Martin Luther Universität, Halle-Wittenberg. So Johann, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you. I'm also very happy to be with you and to speak here. and to present something from my doctoral thesis. I'm first gonna introduce a little bit, and then I'm gonna share my screen and show you the texts I'm working with. So my title is the De Heresibus et Synodis of Germanus I of Constantinople as a source on early Byzantine heresies, prospects of a critical edition. One of the major obstacles to writing the history of Byzantium and Byzantine Christianity in the 7th and 8th centuries is the scarcity of sources. This is all the more true in the field of heresies. But this scarcity should not lead the historian to lower his or her guard when studying sources and trust those sources more readily. The mid-sized treatise De Heresibus et Synodis, attributed to Patriarch Germanus I of Constantinople, in office from 715 to 730, is considered as one of the main sources on Christian heresies in 7th and 8th century Byzantium, for example, in two overview articles on this topic by Jean Goyard and Ilse Rocho. Concerning the attribution of this text to Patriarch Germanus, there are quite a few reasons to challenge this attribution, actually, and it has already been done. But in my forthcoming thesis, I will plead for the authenticity of at least the majority of the text. So here I'm just going to assume that this work is actually has actually been written by Germanus. Still, any approach to this work remains problematic because the only edition available to us is non-critical and heavily outdated. It has been edited by Cardinal Angelo Mai and published in 1842 based on only one manuscript, the Codex Vaticanus Graecus 2198. This edition has been reprinted without changes by Migne in his Patrologia Graeca. With the aim of facilitating research on Germanus' treatise and early Byzantine orthodoxy in general, the first part of my doctoral thesis consists of the critical edition of the De Heresibus et Synodis, based on all 7 accessible manuscripts. An important feature of this new edition, next to the critical apparatus, will be an apparatus of textual sources based on an extensive search for implicit quotations, paraphrases, and allusions. In this paper, I will present 3 passages from Germanus' De Heresibus et Synodis that have been or could be consulted as sources on heretical groups in 7th to 8th century Byzantium, and the results of my text and source critical research. Just on the basis of these results, I will then reassess whether the passages at hand can be considered as historical sources on early Byzantine heresies, and if not, for what else? Thus, I will deduce an approach for further study of the De Heresibus et Synodis from the character of the text itself. Just a short moment. So let's switch to the first text. Germanus on the Manichaeans. The heresy of Manichaeism is presented in chapter 4 of the De Heresibus et Synodis, with a short account of some of its teachings, Mani's activities, and the Christian refutation by Cyril of Jerusalem. This chapter does not rank among the most interesting Western sources on Manichaeism due to its late date. There are nevertheless 2 reasons for it possibly being of interest to Byzantine studies. First, some major heresies of the Middle Byzantine period are, in one way or another, associated with Manichaeism, most prominently Polytheism and Bogomilism. Therefore, any historical evidence for actual Manichaeans still living in the Byzantine world and for their beliefs would be very welcome. A second reason is that Germanus actually gives a list of Mani's books known from no other source. Now, my research preparing the critical edition of the De Heresibus et Synodis has shown that the wording of this chapter is very close to 2 other texts, the Chronicle of Georgios Monachos and the Church History of Socrates Scholasticos. I made a small synopsis of the comparable passages. I will not go into every sentence now, but maybe in general view, you can already see the similarities between the texts. So these similarities between the text of Germanus and first the similarities between the text of Germanus and Socrates, especially in line 12-13 this year, lines 27 to 28, so this part, and lines 41 to 45, so here at the end of the chapter, are easily explained. Germanus used Socrates' church history, either directly or indirectly, and paraphrased parts of its account of Manichaeism. The use of this Vorlage also explains how Germanus' unique list of Mani's books, here at the end of the chapter, the Gospel, Book of the Treasures, Book of the Mysteries, and the Book of the Rites, came to be. It is just a misreading of the source of Socrates' church history, where he lists the books written by Mani as the Gospel, Book of Treasures, or the Treasure Book, the Book of the Mysteries is here, yeah, it's actually in the first place, and as last one, the Book of the Principles. And then he continues another sentence with he pretended to perform certain rites, teletas. So it's actually just a misreading that may have even happened due to physical damage of a manuscript used. But this is how the title of Book of the Rites came to be. Almost all the rest of this chapter has great similarities with the account in the Chronicle of George the Monk. I will scroll up again. So we have here very similar texts, again, very similar phrasing, and so on. So you see already. There can be two explanations. Either George, writing in the 9th century, copied from Germanus, or both of them copied from a common source, a common Vorlage. Acknowledging the sometimes mistakable syntax of Germanus' text, especially in lines 7 to 10. So if you compare these two parts and lines 14 to 17 in this part, where George has a very clear phrasing, the explanation of both authors copying from a common anti-Manichaean source seems much more plausible, because it is very difficult to explain the wording of George to stem from the wording of Germanus. In addition, both texts sharing one sentence adapted to Socrates, which is here in lines 25 to 26. So you can see this is the original in Socrates, and then the text of Germanus and George, indicates that the common source used by both of them was partly based on the account of Socrates. In conclusion, I postulate that Germanus and Georgios Monachos together testified to a lost and so far unknown anti-Manichaean text that is partly based on Socrates' church history and has been composed between the 5th and early 8th centuries, so predating Germanus' treatise. It is possible that Germanus also copied the remaining Socratic sentences. So the phrases he copied from Socrates, including the book list at the end of the chapter. It is possible that he also copied the Socratic sentences from this text, from this intermediate text, rather than directly from Socrates' church history, but this cannot be clearly determined. What does this mean for the source value of Germanus' chapter on Manichaeism? It cannot be considered a historical source for real-life Manichaeism in 7th or 8th century Byzantium, because all the information on Manichaeans of this chapter has been copied from one or more earlier sources. Nevertheless, the value of this chapter 4 of the Haeresibus et Synodis lies exactly in this point. It testifies to the texts an Orthodox theologian of 8th century Byzantium read on Manichaeism, and thus to his views on the heresy of Manichaeism. Text number 2, Germanus on the Montanists. Chapter 5 of Germanus' De Haeresibus et Synodis has been included in a collection of sources on the history of Montanism by Pierre de Labriole, published in 1913. For several reasons, especially the intriguing mention of a forced baptism of Montanists under the rule of Emperor Leo III in 721-22 by Theophanes, scholars wonder whether there were still actual Montanists living in 8th century Byzantium, or if this and other mentions only use the name Montanists for a group without historical connection to the 2nd century heresy, or if this is totally fictional. Looking at this chapter 5, the final part about a priest fighting the Montanist protagonists, which comes here, and so in lines 30 to 36, seems to be inspired by Eusebius's church history, while I could not identify a source for the rest of the text. So you can see it is quite blank here. That this latter part about the priest fighting the Montanists is inspired by Eusebius's account has already, but vaguely, been noted by Angelo Mai in his edition from 1842. With my new critical edition, this textual relationship can be affirmed with more evidence, as the old edition read Soma instead of the priest's name Sota in line 30. Germanus' wording is quite a patchwork of different passages of Eusebius' work, which leads me to suppose the existence of an intermediate source that had the compiled and shortened account of the priest Sota fighting against the Montanists. You can see here, this is from chapter 19 of Eusebius' book 5, then chapter 16 of Eusebius' book 5, and then even more chapter 18 of book 5. So yeah, it's quite a patchwork, and I think it must have been compiled before Germanus copied this information. Regarding the rest of Germanus' chapter 5, so we'll scroll up again. It is quite similar in structure and character to chapter 4 dealing with the Manichaeans. So he's giving an account on their cosmology and some other general teachings, and then coming to the Christian refutation, like in the chapter on the Manichaeans. Here he is telling the story of this priest Sota, and then also giving a literary reference to Epiphanius, like he did before in the chapter on the Manichaeans, with the reference to Cyril of Jerusalem. So as I said, this chapter seems quite similar in structure and character to the chapter on the Manichaeans. And given the close connection of Manichaeans and Montanists noted at the beginning of chapter 4, if we go up again in the first line of chapter 4, they're very closely connected. It is even possible that both chapters actually have the same source, so an anti-Manichaean and anti-Montanist text that is otherwise lost. But this hypothesis cannot be proven, and the account on the Montanists might also stem from another source than the one on the Manichaeans. But still, it becomes clear that this chapter on the Montanists does not rely on actual research on real-life Montanists done by Germanus. In conclusion, this passage on Montanism cannot be regarded as a historical source on this heresy either, but all the same as a source on the Byzantine Orthodox theologians' view on it. And third passage, Germanus on the Christological controversies. At last, I want to move to the Christological controversies of the 5th to 7th centuries, because this is the dogmatic battle where one is to expect the highest actuality and accuracy from Germanus' treatise, as he was just living at the end of them and was still somehow involved in the aftermath. Germanus' portrayal of these controversies can be seen best in chapter 47, a short recapitulation of the ecumenical councils he discussed earlier in his treatise. So Germanus quotes for each council a relevant dogmatic formula, as you can see here for the First Council of Nicaea. He quotes from the Confession of Nicaea, from the symbol. Then for the First Council of Constantinople in 381, he quotes from the symbol of Constantinople. Then he still correctly does quote for the Council of Chalcedon, the Fourth Council, from the dogmatic formula of Chalcedon. And then for the Third Council of Constantinople, in 680-681, he again quotes correctly from the dogmatic formulas, as you can see here. But there's a problem with the councils of Ephesus, 431, and the Second Council of Constantinople, 553. Regarding the Council of Ephesus, so it starts here in line 10, he actually quotes a mix of formulas from the Council of Chalcedon and the formula of reunion from the year 433, which is preserved in letters between Cyril and John of Antioch. And then again, there's a problem with the Second Council of Constantinople of the year 553, which starts here, the Fifth Council. And there, Germanus quotes a formula from the Acts of the Council of the Lateran Council from the year 649. So an explanation for this phenomenon would be that the councils of Ephesus and Constantinople too did not give a positive dogmatic formula, just as the other councils did. So that Germanus was looking for a positive formula to give to these councils, and he might even have found it already also in a previous source, and that it was already compiled in a text like this, because Germanus is also using the wording, really the same wording for the councils of Ephesus and the Second Council of Constantinople in the chapters 25 and 34, where he's explaining more on these councils. So it is possible that he used such a council synopsis that had these strange attributions of dogmatic formulas already, but it's also possible that he compiled it himself. In conclusion, this shows that also on the Christological controversies, his treatise cannot be used as a historical source and as a source on the events of this Christological controversies, but it can be used as a source, again, for his views on this, and also for the concept of councils, the Concilsidee, the idea of church councils in Byzantium in this period. To come to an end, I hope to have shown that how a proper critical edition can help to reassess the character and source value of a text. This might seem quite trivial, but it's still important for handling texts, especially texts that are still not edited in a modern and proper way. And I have also shown that this approach gives a great shift of the study scope of the De Haeresibus et Synodis, because I will not treat it anymore as a historical source on events or groups, but as a source on Orthodox theology in 8th century Byzantium. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Johann. Okay, well, we now go to questions, and that people can either indicate in some way, or probably the best way is to make some remark on the chat, and either I will read or ask people to contribute. Well, while people are collecting their thoughts, I have a question for Paolo. You mentioned the transfer of Byzantine legislation over into Dušan's code towards the end of your paper. I mean, what do you think is more important to Dušan, that he's got legislation to deal with a current problem, or the fact that he's been able to actually just transfer Byzantine Byzantine legislation, and that he shows himself to have that sort of status?
Yes, thank you for the question, Andrew. I would propend for the fact that he transferred the legislation to have like a sort of political legitimation. It was very useful to him to appear like a Byzantine legislator, like a Byzantine ruler. And I mean, I think that there was an important political point. I mean, legislation is always useful because Byzantine legislation was quite developed if you compare to the Serbian legislation or customary law, which is even worse. So I think both, let's say, 75% political ideology and 25% the real use of law. Probably Byzantine law was mainly used in the southern part, where you have the Greek provinces, and but in the northern part, I do agree with the scholars who say that their Serbian customary law survived de facto. De jure, you have the legislation, but de facto, probably they were regulating the social juridical relations by using customary law, especially in criminal and penal law, which is quite critical.
No, thank you. We have in fact, Boris Sokiewicz that says he has a small comment on Paolo's paper, and so do you want to come in?
Instead of raising hand, I wrote in the chat.
Yeah, that's good.
So, thank you all for your very interesting papers. I was truly enjoying all of this. My also comment.
I cannot hear.
We do.
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Now,
yes.
That was my problem.
Okay. Actually, I was thinking of something when you mentioned Paul Verzi, so the half believers. There is still, I think, more than 100 of years of discussion on the who actually are Paul Verzi. Most scholars still do, I would not say equal them completely with Bogomils, but
sorry, gentlemen, I'm losing the connection.
Should I write only that?
It may be preferable. You're
yes,
right.
I'll write to Paolo.
Yes, if you write, I don't know why I'm losing the connection.
No problem, I'll write you. So you can continue, and in the meantime, I will write. No problem.
It sounds a good question. Yeah, please do. Jan.
I have this general commentary. I'm really impressed by all your papers, Petra, Paolo, Pavla, and Johann. They may be characterized by very careful analysis of sources. I will be very happy to see your papers in our journal, Studia Ceranea, because as I see, you just have opportunity to present part of your studies. And I have one short question as a lazy researcher to Johann, which may spare me some studies. Have you tried a connection or some dependencies between Timothy Presbyter, his account on the reception of heretics, in the part concerning the Manichaeans with Germanos? They are very close chronologically.
Yes, of course, I have looked into it, but intriguingly, there's no no great similarity between the texts. As you said, they're very close chronologically, but regarding the content and the wording, it's not close at all.
Okay, thank you. You spare a lot of my time. Thank you very much.
I have a question for Pavla, if that's okay. And then we'll come to Boris's question. Your sort of statistical approach was fascinating. I thought it was a really clever way of approaching to the text. Do you want to speculate? And I emphasize it would be speculate, and no one's going to hold you to account on this, because I appreciate you're quite early in the project. But what's going on in Prokopios's mind when he starts using the same sort of vocabulary for the Persians as for the Slavs? What are we to conclude? Is this a hierarchy of barbarians, or is this some sort of that he's putting people into various classifications? I just wondered where it was going.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. To be honest, I'm not sure if I really can answer it, but just concerning various topics that Prokopios noted in the context with Slavs, I could see that there exists let's say a strange policy concerning the vocabulary. Concerning some topics, there are more similar vocabulary, for example, to Huns. Concerning some topics, the vocabulary is more similar to Persians, and I don't think that he really had in his mind that, I don't know, the nations would be similar, but he was just writing about some topics that maybe at the moment seemed to be, close to him. For example, I don't know, the lifestyle of the Slavs was close to the lifestyle of nomads, so he used similar vocabulary. The cult of nymphs was similar in his mind to the cult in Daphne that was visited and practiced also by Persians, so he used the similar vocabulary. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure, but I wouldn't really. In my project, I don't see that. Let's say it's something very deliberate, but
yeah. These are not carefully chosen words. They are much more revealing as to just how he sees things. No, I was because the Persians must have been sort of quite advanced, but and it's odd that he's using the same words as for the Slavs, who he would see as presumably much less advanced. Right, we have Boris's question. I'm struggling slightly with it. So half believers are sometimes more considered as bogomils or some other heretics Bosnian patterns, etc., rather than the Latin heresy, since Roman Catholicism is clearly here pointed out. So most scholars, even in old Yugoslavia, thought that these were some heretics, as well as the mention of Babun and Babunska, word of babuns, which are also considered some heretics. Also, the Latin heresy is used by Theodosius in his life of Saint Sava. So mostly these two are differentiated. What do you think of these sort of speculations, Paolo?
Yes, can you hear me? I turned off the video. So I do agree, especially because in chapter 10 you have very strong, harsh punishment. So I do not imagine these punishments against Latin Catholic believers. So yes, I would say that I do agree. And another thing that we normally think that the terminology is always very precise. Sometimes I have the idea that the different words are used like synonyms. So in a modern way, I mean, I'm a jurist, so each word has a precise meaning in the modern view. But I have the impression that in the past it was not so precise. So I would not be surprised if they mixed the words. I don't know how to say better that. So maybe another word is used instead of another one.
Yes, it's the same with classes of the Serbian medieval society. It's always quite complicated to see who belongs to which part of the society. So it is exactly what Paolo thought with that.
I can suggest to read the Syntagma of Blastares in the Serbian version, because there you have a big vocabulary, legal vocabulary from ancient Greek, from Byzantine Greek to Slav, and you can also use maybe the Roman terminology. For instance, you have the word andrapodon, which is translated, which is the Roman mancipium, but they translate in the Serbian version like rab, like slave. I mean, it's the medieval meaning, so it's the evolution of the meaning. But if you look by the point of view of a Roman lawyer, it's not very precise if you want to translate the term mancipium, because mancipium has two meanings. And the word slave is like the evolution of the Roman concept. So it's more medieval. So, I mean, I have the idea that all the words are not used very, very precisely. We do the same mistakes today.
Okay, thank you, Paolo, and indeed, thank you, Professor Stojkowski, who I now can read the name properly. It's slightly larger lettering. Any more questions? If not, then I have one more question for in fact, Petra, are you?
Oh, I just had a comment. I just wanted to thank Johann for the insightful comments. It was really very interesting paper. Thank you. And I wanted to thank Andrew for moderating. Thank you, Andrew, very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Well, before I bring then proceedings to a close, I believe that Bojana Radovanovic has got an announcement or even an invitation to make. Bojana.
Yes, hello everyone. But first I would like to make a short comment on this session and to say that do you hear me well? Yes. Yeah. So I also wanted to say that I liked the session very much, and every paper was really interesting and important. Well, the most thing I have to say about Pavla, and I just wanted to say that I also dealt with Prokopios a little bit, and I know what he's talking about, what you mentioned about faith and about everything. I just wanted to say that this is really, for me, a good method in looking the words and literary constructs, and it's the same I did in my PhD, and I think it's very good, and especially because you are doing just in one and the same, you're analyzing one and the same author. So this must lead to good conclusions, because you do not compare two different authors, because if we have two different authors, then the danger is that the same word is not understood in the same way by the two different authors. That's what I want to say. And just on this word on destiny or fate, heresies, I don't know if Prokopios maybe uses some other word like Tyche or Moira, or maybe in other descriptions of other nations, maybe he uses other words for faith as well. Or is it always heresies? So.
So thank you very much for your comment and question. Actually, Prokopios used the term Tyche quite a lot.
Yes.
But when I studied the cases, its content was quite different. Let's say to the content of the statement about the Slavs. He's very often using Tyche in the sense, let's say, of the god, that something happened because of Tyche, that Tyche influenced, I don't know, some situation. So it's a really huge topic concerning Tyche, the concept of Tyche and Prokopios, and concerning the verb used by Prokopios for the Slavs, mei Romai or hei marmene, I didn't manage to find any other case in his text. So it was really interesting that the way how he spoke about the Slavs concerning the faith, it's really unique. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It's because we know that Slavs basically did believe in faith. We have this, so that is because it's perplexing. But thank you very much to everyone. And I basically wanted to say something else. It's very recently, Jan Wolski and me, we agreed to organize kind of online seminars, which will be on Christian dualist heresies and heresiology, mostly we could say on the Bogomils, but not only on the Bogomilism, also on related, so to say, similar connected heresies. What we would like to do is to gather together scholars who do research on Christian dualist heresies and heresiology. And we plan to organize one session per month, and we will start in May. Our first speaker, should be Jen Andautovic, and then we will reveal to you later, step by step, who will the other speakers be. But particularly, we are open, of course, to your suggestions. We would like to cordially invite you to participate. It will be online, and yes, we will also concentrate on the topics, on some of the highly debated topics. For example, this connection east-west, and maybe the topics on Bosnian Church, which have been discussed a lot, but never, maybe we need a fresh outlook on some topics, and so we will see. And we ask you, so we would, if you are interested in, we would maybe contact you via emails, and we will write to you on our newest developments and decisions and what's new. So we will inform you via email if you're interested. Jan, would you like to add something, please?
Thank you. We started to think about this seminar in December. It's like sowing the seed and waiting till it grows. Thinking, should we do it? How it shall look like? And such events like this conference makes me think, yes, we should. And how it should like. It's enough to give people possibility to speak, to interact, and everything will go its proper way. We'll email you soon about
Yes, And yes, and what I think we will put up set up another platform. I don't think it will be this one, but we will still decide on that.
Thank you immensely. That sounds very exciting, and you know, presumably we can spread it to the wider heresiarch community. And I think that this will be a very interesting forum for discussion. Okay, well, I think that more or less wraps things up, unless anybody else has any contributions. It only remains me then to thank you, the audience, for turning up from your many places in the world, and to thank Jan and the other organizers for making this all technically possible. And finally, of course, to the speakers who have given us a really excellent session. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock Polish time, and in the meantime, we have time for lunch. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jan.